A Hymn to God, my God, in My Sickness, by John Donne. Since I am coming to that holy room, where with thy choir of saints forevermore I shall be made thy music, as I come, I tune the instrument here at the door, and what I must do then, think here before. Whilst my physicians by their love are grown cosmographers, and I their map, who lie flat on this bed, that by them may be shown that this is my southwest discovery, perfectum febris, by these straits to die. I joy that in these straits I see my west, for though their currents yield return to none, what shall my west hurt me, as west and east, in all flat maps, and I am one, are one, so death doth touch the resurrection? Is the Pacific Sea my home, or are the eastern riches, is Jerusalem? Anyan and Magellan and Gibraltar, all straits, and none but straits, are ways to them, whether where Japhet dwelt, or Ham, or Shem. We think that Paradise and Calvary, Christ's cross and Adam's tree, stood in one place. Look, Lord, and find both Adams met in me. As the first Adam's sweat surrounds my face, may the last Adam's blood my soul embrace. So in his purple wrapped, receive me, Lord. By these his thorns, give me his other crown. And as to others' souls, I preached thy word. Be this my text, my sermon to mine own. Therefore, that he may raise, the Lord throws down. Well, that is a favorite poem of mine, particularly by one of my favorite poets, John Donne. And today, March 31st, is the anniversary of his death. And so I thought it was appropriate to read, a poem by him for you, but also that particular poem. He wrote it during a time of sickness. Some sources claim that he wrote it just a few days before he died. Or some other sources say that he wrote it during a previous terrible sickness and fever where he thought he was going to die. That's clearly what is on his mind in this poem. So it's appropriate to read it on the day of his death. I think it's also appropriate to read this poem for a few reasons that we find in our own life and world right now, especially this being a time of great sickness, a time of going through some tough straits, some tough times that we're dealing with, and then also because of where this poem eventually takes us. The final destination of the poem is Christ's cross, which is our destination, particularly in these last few days leading up to Good Friday and Easter. So, a little bit about John Donne. He is a master of English poetry. And he, just so you know, when he lived, he was born in 1572 and died in 1631. So he's just a little bit younger than William Shakespeare. Not really the next generation even. They're sort of contemporaries, but Donne would have been on the younger side of things. And John Donne is known, he's famous for two kinds of poems. It's very likely that if you took any kind of literature class in, say, in high school or college English, you would have read some poems by John Donne, and it might have been from one or both of these two major parts of his work. He's known for his love poems, which mostly come from earlier in his life, mainly in his younger, more wild days, chasing after young women. But then his other set of poems are sacred poems dealing with all kinds of different theological themes. This one being one of those, of course, and that those mostly come from his time later in life after he became a minister in the Church of England. So yes, I don't know if I mentioned that before. He lived in the in Elizabethan England in the time of Queen Elizabeth I, and then also King James I. And eventually he rose to quite prominence in the Church of England. He became the Dean of St. Paul's Cathedral in London, which means he's sort of the position just under the Bishop of London. He was sort of the head guy of the cathedral itself. John Donne is also especially known for something that English professors and scholars and people of his time called wit. And so people still refer to this when they talk about John Donne and some of the other poets that are like him from this time period. But it's kind of a hard word to define. When we hear wit nowadays, we kind of think of something being witty, right? That it's funny. And it's funny in a clever sort of way. It's not slapstick. It's not just a really bad pun or a dad joke, but there's a little bit more cleverness to it. And that's true in what the Elizabethans considered to be wit, that there's this clever aspect to it, and sometimes it is humorous, though not necessarily. That it's not the same thing when we say, "Oh, that's so witty," as in it's really funny in sort of a clever way. Really, what they meant when they talked about wit, they were trying to describe the creative side of the mind, the poetic side of intelligence. So intelligence encompasses a broad array of things, right? Just knowing information, and then also sort of wisdom, how to use that information. But then there's also the poetic side, the creative side, where you're actually making something, using your intelligence to make a work of art. And it's also, when they talk about wit, they'd also be referring to the part of your mind that you use to discover connections between different things. Things that might appear to be quite different, quite separate, are actually linked. They are analogous to each other. And so that comes up all over in John Donne's poetry through the use of metaphor, which is what this poem does, is a really good example of that. His poems are just full of metaphor, where you are comparing two different things and seeing the analogies between them, where you're learning about one thing by means of another. So in the case of this poem, which is a quite extended analogy between sickness and death on the one hand, and the exploration of the world and map making in the other. And these are seems like these are very two different things and have nothing in common. And John Donne's poem shows the analogy between them and helps us learn more about the one, the death and the sickness, by means of the other, by means of looking at exploring the world and making maps. Harold Bloom, the late Harold Bloom, was a great 20th century critic and writer about literature, and he made this great anthology here called The Best Poems of the English Language, from Chaucer through Frost. If you want one book of poetry that has sort of the best of everything, this would be one of my top recommendations, this book of poems collected by Harold Bloom. And in it, there's just one little sentence that I liked when Harold Bloom is summing up who John Donne was. He says, eloquence and shrewdness in behalf of the invisible are not often so combined. So John Donne, especially in all of his poems, not just his sacred poems, even in his love poems, he's searching after, he wants to find and study and learn and ponder the invisible, and in the way he uses eloquence and shrewdness, Harold Bloom says that those are rarely seen combined together in pursuit of understanding and pondering the invisible world, the world of love and death and all those kinds of abstract things. I would say that I would kind of explain shrewdness here as a sharp perception that John Donne perceives things as they really are, which goes to how he can make analogies between two very different things. And so his sharp perception of reality, of the nature of things, is seen in his extended metaphors, like we see in this poem here, Hymn to God in my sickness. So I'm going to walk through the poem and make comments as I go, and then I'll read it again all the way through at the end. I probably won't read the entire poem right now as I discuss it. I will have a link along with the video down in the description of the video, where you can link to the text of the poem so that you can read it along with me if you want. So remember, John Donne, the author, the poet, is lying on what he supposes is his deathbed, right? Whether it was actually his deathbed or not, we don't know. It's kind of beside the point. He thinks he's going to die. He is in serious sickness, a serious fever. And he says, I'm coming to that holy room, which is heaven, right? And going to join in with the choirs of saints. And so he's thinking about his final destination, where he will sing with all the saints, will make music to God's glory. And so he says, before I do that, I need to tune the instrument, my instrument. We could describe that as his soul, right, before he enters God's heavenly throne room. I think in particular, the instrument that John Donne refers to is his poetic faculty, his ability to create, which of course is what you use to create music too, right? And it's what he's using here to actually create this poem, to actually create this meditation on death and going to heaven. That's the instrument that he is tuning right now. And so the tuning of the instrument is the preparation for your death, right? It's kind of a nice way to think of it, that heaven, if heaven is the great symphony that we're going to perform around God's throne room, then before we get there, before we can actually start playing the full symphony, we need to tune our instruments first. Then, so there's a little metaphor right there. He just throws that metaphor of the instrument and tuning and music just in the first stanza of the poem, and then he discards that and moves on to a much longer metaphor where he uses the imagery of a map. He says that his physicians, by their love, that is, by their loving attention on his body, on his sickness, they are become cosmographers, map makers, right? And he says, and my body is their map. So he's lying flat on his bed, like a map, flat on a table with all the physicians, the cosmographers around him, studying him and ministering over him. And he says, or I guess we should keep in mind when John Donne lived and what his world was like. I said he lived during the time of Queen Elizabeth I and King James I. This is the time of discovery, right? This is the age of exploration and map making, is particularly of the New World, right? Of going and exploring North and South America and all the great explorers that went over there and made maps of their journeys. And so this is very contemporary image for him to use. Well, he says that through his map makers, his physicians, examining him, studying him, treating him, it is discovered that it is shown that this fever, this sickness, is his southwest discovery. So the south would be considered the region of heat, right? That he's sick with fever. And the west would be considered the region of decline, death, right? Think of the sun. The sun rises in the east and sets in the west. So the east is the region of new life, and the west is the region of decline and death. So he says, this is my southwest discovery, and throws a bit of Latin in there, as was very common for his time period. He would have been very fluent in classical languages like Latin and Greek. And he says per fretum febris, which means by the strait of fever. And here he introduces the image of the straits. So a strait being a narrow body of water that connects to larger bodies of water, right? I love going up and camping around the Straits of Mackinac that goes under the Mackinac Bridge that connects Lake Huron to Lake Michigan. But you have straits all over the world, and he mentions some famous straits later on. So a strait, in the sense of a narrow, often can be a difficult passage of water, a channel that you have to navigate carefully. And then also by reason of metaphor, the straits of suffering, sort of a narrow place that you have to go through in life, where things close in and press you hard, right? And his particular strait in this case is this fever that is leading him to death. But John Donne is not describing this in a fearful sense. He's actually saying that this strait, this tough passage that he has to get through, is actually going to lead to the discovery of a new world. Right? Again, so he's conjuring up this idea of going and exploring a new world, and he says that's what my death is. that it's going to take me from this world to the next. So he says, I rejoice that in these straits I see my west, my end, right? But not just the end of death, because he says, though their currents yield return to none, you can't come back from death. You can't fight against this current. He says, what shall my west hurt me? Death's not going to hurt me. I'm going to go through it. And we're going to find out later how is that possible, that he can go through the narrow strait of death and not be hurt by it. And he says, as west and east in all flat maps are one, and he, in parentheses we have, and I am one. Remember, I'm a map. So death doth touch resurrection. So in a map, east and west, even though they're on opposite sides of the page, they are actually one, right? The world is round. So east and west always meet each other. In a way, the sun is always rising and setting, right? It's really the same place. It's a matter of perspective. And so in Christian terms, in the terms of Christ's death and resurrection, we have Jesus, who is our sun. He is our east. He is the resurrection and the life, right? And then we have our west, our death, and yet John Donne's pointing out, just like in a map, east and west are the same, are one. And so our death is also one with Christ, who is our resurrection. And he'll expand on that in a couple more stanzas here. He continues with this map and straits metaphor by talking about different places on the map, right? The Pacific Sea, that's, the Pacific Ocean, that is, the word Pacific is, peaceful. You have the eastern riches, you have Jerusalem. These are all metaphors for heaven, right? And he lists then some straits, some famous straits, Anyan and Magellan and Gibraltar. These are straits that you have to go through in order to get to those places. In order to get to those lovely, beautiful places of the East that he mentioned before, you have to go through some difficult straits, some tight spots. You have to go on an arduous journey of some kind to reach those glorious destinations. And he says, it doesn't matter where you live, whether you're dwelling with Japhet or Ham or Shem. Those are the three sons of Noah. And it's a old tradition that those three sons are sort of the fathers. Well, of course, the Bible tells us they are the fathers of the human race after Noah, but the tradition is that they are the fathers of the three continents, Japhet being the father of Europe, Ham is the father of Africa, and Shem the father of Asia. So he's just describing, wherever you are in the world, you've got to go through these tough passages to get to these glorious destinations. And then he comes to the climax of this whole map metaphor. And he's going to leave it here and go on to talk in a very straightforward way what this all means in a spirit, according to our faith. But don't miss sort of this climax of the map metaphor where he says, we think that paradise and Calvary, Christ's cross and Adam's tree stood in one place. So if you could plot the Garden of Eden and Golgotha on a map, it's the same place. Now, that's another old tradition that he's drawing on, an old church tradition. but even, it doesn't really matter if it's factually true or not. We can't know that. We still have the theological truth behind it, and you see this in a lot of icons, where an icon of Jesus's death on the cross, underneath the cross is a skull, and so that's Adam's skull, that he was supposedly buried there. But of course, the point is that Christ, the second Adam, dies in Adam's place, and his cleansing blood, drips down the cross and into Adam's grave to forgive him and give him new life, right? We have the same kind of iconography or imagery in the connection between the two trees, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, where the devil brought sin into the world through the temptation of that tree to Adam and Eve. But then you have the tree of the cross, where the devil is overcome by Jesus's tree. And then so even you have Adam and Eve bringing sin and death into the world by eating fruit from that tree, the tree of knowledge, and you have the forgiveness of sins and eternal life being brought into the world by us who eat from the tree of Jesus's cross. Right? We have a really wonderful hymn in our Lutheran service book called "The Tree of Life," which connects these two trees together. That Jesus' cross is our new tree. So the point that John Donne is making is absolutely wonderful. It doesn't matter if the tradition that he's referencing is true or not. The theological point is absolutely true. And so because of that, because Christ is the second Adam, and that he takes the place of the first Adam by his, he covers over Adam's sin, his disobedience, and he destroys Adam's death by his own obedience, his righteousness, and his holy death. John Donne prays, look on me and see both of those Adams met together, just like, again, the East and the West meet each other. See how both of those Adams are in me. I know I'm a son of the first Adam, and his sweat surrounds my face. Right? So he is born with original sin. That expresses itself in his life of sin and in this life of toil. Right? That God says, by the sweat of your brow you will labor and eat bread until you return to the dust. And so it's the sweat of labor in this fallen world. It's the sweat of sickness, this fever that Donne is experiencing. That's the sweat of the first Adam that he is covered in. But he says, may the last Adam's blood my soul embrace. So let me have both Adams. Let both Adams be met in me as I cling to my second Adam, Jesus, whose blood covers me and cleanses me. And so he says, I'm wrapped in Christ's purple, his purple or scarlet robe, that the soldiers put on Jesus to mock him. Donne sees that as an image of Christ's suffering and death itself, his satisfaction that he made for sinners. And so he says, let me be wrapped in that purple. Let me be covered in Christ's righteousness, clothed with Jesus and everything good that he is. He says, by these his thorns give me his other crown. So because of Jesus' crown of thorns, I can be crowned with a crown of glory, the crown of life everlasting, right? So Jesus' death changes our death. That's why John Donne didn't need to be afraid of going through those narrow straits of death, because it was going to lead into a new world. Because Jesus' death brings us to God. It makes us acceptable to God. And then at the very end here, he references his life as a preacher, his calling as a minister of the word. He says, I preached the word to other people. So now, Lord, let this final little text here, this final sermon, be preached. Let it be a sermon for my soul, for my own soul as well, right? So that I might also be saved. And he says, that his little text, his sermon is, therefore that he may raise, the Lord throws down. This is just the classic, beautiful mystery of God's working, that he's the one who raises up and throws down, right? There's this whole great reversal thing. Jesus' death itself, that the Lord of life should die, and that by dying we are made alive, right? And so there's no glory for Christ without first his suffering. That's what Christ says, that first he had to suffer before he could enter his glory. And there's no Easter without a Good Friday. And so likewise for us, each as individuals, there is no resurrection for us without first our death. We die with Christ to sin in baptism, and in baptism we are raised with Christ to new life of righteousness. And that is all wrapped up and brought to completion in finally our dying to this life and being raised to the life of the world to come. That is the wondrous way of God. And that is a great comfort for us, even when we are dealing with sickness, even when considering the fear and terror of death, that God works through these things. He brings us through these tight, narrow passages, also that he can bring us out into the wide, beautiful new world of life forever with him. All right, let me read the poem one last time. A Hymn to God, my God, in My Sickness, by John Donne. Since I am coming to that holy room, where with thy choir of saints forevermore I shall be made thy music, as I come, I tune the instrument here at the door, and what I must do then, think here before. Whilst my physicians by their love are grown cosmographers, and I their map, who lie flat on this bed, that by them may be shown that this is my southwest discovery, perfectum febris, by these straits to die. I joy that in these straits I see my west. For though their currents yield return to none, what shall my west hurt me? As west and east in all flat maps, and I am one, are one, so death doth touch the resurrection. Is the Pacific Sea my home? Or are the eastern riches, is Jerusalem? Anyan and Magellan and Gibraltar, all straits, and none but straits, are ways to them, whether where Japhet dwelt, or Cam, or Shem. We think that Paradise and Calvary, Christ's cross and Adam's tree, stood in one place. Look, Lord, and find both Adams met in me. As the first Adam's sweat surrounds my face, may the last Adam's blood my soul embrace. So in his purple wrapped, receive me, Lord. By these his thorns, give me his other crown. And as to others' souls I preached thy word, be this my text, my sermon to mine own. Therefore that he may raise, the Lord throws down. Thanks for joining me, and God's blessings on the rest of your day.